I spent nearly 3 months buried in this one. It started with a box of scanned unit historical records from the Australian War Memorial. Dense, handwritten logs that someone had filled out every single day in the jungle heat of Phuoc Tuy Province. I wasn't looking for what I found. I was researching something else entirely. But I kept stopping, kept going back, because the contrast between what I was reading in those Australian pages and what I was reading in the American equivalents was so stark that I had to understand it. The Australians weren't just keeping better records. They were building something, a living, breathing picture of an enemy that the Americans, for all their resources, kept struggling to see clearly. When I finally understood why, the whole question of how Australia punched so far above its weight in Vietnam suddenly made a different kind of sense. October 17th, 1966. 6 weeks after Long Tan. The briefing room at 1st Australian Task Force Headquarters, Nui Dat, Phuoc Tuy Province. A young intelligence officer, Lieutenant Robert Swanton, is working through the night, not reconstructing what just happened, but building forward. On his desk, a stack of war diary entries, written daily by every sub-unit in the Australian area of operations. Patrol debrief summaries, contact reports, track analysis from the SAS. The kind of granular, sequenced record that lets a trained analyst see not where the enemy was, but where he's going. What I kept thinking, working through those documents 50-plus years later, was how alive they were. These weren't bureaucratic filings completed under deadline pressure. They were running accounts, daily entries, each one building on the last, each one forcing the writer to articulate today what he observed, what he inferred, what had changed. The cumulative effect was extraordinary. Read enough of them in sequence, and you start to see what those intelligence officers saw: pattern, rhythm, intention. Across the wire, in the American headquarters at Long Bin, and throughout Military Assistance Command Vietnam, a different administrative reality operated. Weekly situation reports, quarterly operational reports, lessons learned. After-action analyses completed weeks after contact, when detail had faded and context had blurred. Not because American officers were careless, not because American intelligence professionals lacked skill, but because the system, the reporting architecture, was built on a different philosophy. The Australians wrote every day, and that habit, inherited from a century of British and Commonwealth military tradition, shaped everything that followed. What I found when I traced this back, through the Malayan Emergency, through Borneo, through the regimental culture of units like 1 RAR and 3 RAR, was a story about the relationship between documentation and understanding, about how the discipline of writing forces the discipline of seeing, and about how that discipline, repeated daily across an entire task force operating in a single province, produced an intelligence advantage that American officers found quietly baffling. When American advisors first began working alongside Australian units in Vietnam in any sustained capacity, the paperwork surprised them. Not the volume. American headquarters generated paper at an industrial rate. What surprised them was the texture, the granularity, the insistence on daily written records for units whose American equivalents filed consolidated weekly summaries at best. I came across a reference from an American liaison officer attached to one ATF in 1966, who reportedly described the Australian administrative culture as almost Victorian. He meant it as a mild criticism. He didn't understand, yet, what it was for. The Australian Army's war diary system traced its lineage directly to the British Army's field service regulations of the First World War. Every deployed unit, from battalion level down to certain sub-unit formations, was required to maintain a daily running record of operations, intelligence, personnel changes, weather, equipment status, and any contact with the enemy. Not after the week was done. Not when headquarters requested a summary. Every day. The diary was a contemporaneous document, not a retrospective one. This distinction matters enormously, and it took me a while to fully appreciate why. A retrospective document is shaped by outcome. You know how the week ended, and that knowledge, consciously or not, influences how you describe the week. A contemporaneous document captures uncertainty in real time. It records what the observer believed to be true at the moment of observation before confirmation or contradiction arrived. For intelligence purposes, that quality, the preservation of the uncertainty itself, is invaluable. You can trace how a picture developed. You can go back and ask, at what point did the pattern become visible? What was the first indicator? When should an alert analyst have connected the dots? The Americans, by contrast, had evolved a reporting culture shaped by a different set of institutional priorities. MACV's reporting architecture emphasized upward aggregation. Information flowed from company to battalion, to brigade, to division, to corps, each level synthesizing and condensing, until what reached senior commanders was a statistical portrait. Body counts, sorties flown, kilometers patrolled, tons of supplies interdicted. General Westmoreland's headquarters was famously, some would say, obsessively, oriented around quantification. Progress in Vietnam, the theory went, could be measured. And if it could be measured, it could be reported upward in formats that senior civilian and military leadership could assess. The Australian system wasn't anti-quantitative. The war diaries recorded numbers too. Patrol contacts, casualties, distances covered. But the emphasis was different. The emphasis was on narrative. What happened today? What we saw? What we think it means? Who we spoke to in which village, and what they told us, and what we made of it. The diary kept the observer inside the account rather than abstracting him out of it. I kept finding American officers, in memoirs, in oral history interviews, in after-action assessments, expressing frustration at the difficulty of building a clear picture of enemy activity in their AOs. They had data. They had it in abundance. What they often lacked was the sequence that gave the data meaning. The Australians, by writing every day, preserved the sequence almost by default. To understand why the Australians wrote this way, you have to go back before Vietnam. You have to go to Malaya. The Malayan Emergency, 1948 to 1960, was the formative experience for an entire generation of Australian officers. British and Commonwealth forces, including significant Australian contingents, fought a counterinsurgency campaign against the Malayan Communist Party's armed wing in terrain that was, in some respects, even more demanding than Vietnam. Dense jungle, dispersed enemy, a population that required winning rather than destroying. The campaign produced what became known as the Briggs Plan, later evolved under General Templer, and it was defined above all by patience, intelligence-led operations, and meticulous record-keeping. In Malaya, tracking the enemy meant understanding patterns that unfolded over months and years, not days and weeks. Camp locations, resupply routes, sympathizer networks, water sources. The enemy's behavior in the jungle was shaped by physical and logistical necessities that, if documented carefully enough, became predictable. Units that maintained detailed, continuous records of patrol observations built up a picture that units relying on periodic summaries simply couldn't match. Australian officers who served in Malaya brought that lesson back with them institutionally embedded. It wasn't a tactical insight they carried as personal wisdom. It was reflected in doctrine, in training, in the administrative requirements they considered normal. When those officers arrived in Vietnam, the war diary was as unremarkable to them as the SLR rifle. It was standard equipment. The unit that perhaps exemplified this most completely was the Australian SAS, 1 Squadron SAS Regiment, which deployed to Vietnam in 1966 and operated throughout Phuoc Tuy Province on long-range reconnaissance patrols that lasted up to 17 days. The SAS patrol debrief process was extraordinarily rigorous. Every patrol returned to base and conducted a formal debrief that was then transcribed into the intelligence record. Track lines noted on maps, enemy sightings with grid references, estimated strengths, direction of movement, equipment observed. The aggregate of those debriefs fed into the daily intelligence summaries that flowed through the war diary system, produced a surveillance picture of Phuoc Tuy that had no American equivalent. What I found when I compared the SAS patrol records against the subsequent operational activity of one ATF was striking. Repeatedly, operations that made contact with enemy main force units did so in areas where the patrol intelligence had indicated movement. The intelligence wasn't always specific, but it was continuous. The thread was never dropped. The contrast with American SAS equivalent operations, MACVSOG teams, LRRP elements, wasn't necessarily one of courage or skill. American long-range reconnaissance personnel were extraordinary soldiers. The contrast was in how their intelligence was processed and retained. Patrol debriefs fed into the American system and were aggregated upward, where they competed with air reconnaissance reports, signals intelligence, agent reports, and the constant pressure of headquarters demanding quantifiable metrics. The granular patrol observation, 3 men seen moving south-southeast along a ridgeline at 0920 carrying B-40 launchers, could easily be lost in that processing chain. In the Australian system, it was in the war diary by nightfall. Colonel Francis Whitelaw, who served on the 1 ATF intelligence staff, described the approach in a post-war interview with the Australian War Memorial. "We knew that province," he said. "We knew it the way a policeman knows his beat. Not because we were smarter than the Americans, because we never stopped looking and we never stopped writing down what we saw." August 17th, 1966, 5 days before Long Tan. This is the moment that stopped me cold when I first found it. The intelligence picture being built through the Australian war diary system was already showing increased enemy activity in the Long Tan area. SAS patrol reports had noted movement consistent with main force unit repositioning. Village intelligence, the kind of granular, human source reporting that flowed through one ATF's province team networks into the daily intelligence record, had indicated unusual resupply activity. The 5th and 6th Battalions of D445 Provincial Mobile Unit and elements of 275 Regiment, main force, were somewhere in Phuoc Tuy in strength. The Australians knew this because they had written it down, not in a weekly summary. In a daily, accumulating record that an experienced intelligence officer could read backward through weeks of entries and identify the shape of a threat that was still assembling. On August 18th, a patrol from D Company, 6 RAR, made contact with an enemy element south of the Long Tan rubber plantation. The contact was brief. The patrol withdrew. That evening, the intelligence officer at Task Force Headquarters made an entry in the daily intelligence summary, noting the contact, the grid reference, the estimated enemy strength, and the inference, tentative but explicit, that this was a screening element for a larger force. That entry went into the record. It stayed there. 4 days later, on August 18th, D Company walked into one of the most intense company-level engagements in the history of the Australian Army. 108 men against an estimated 2,500 enemy. They held their ground. The artillery was already registered on the likely enemy approach routes, partly because those routes had been documented in patrol reports and war diary entries over weeks and months. The enemy had been studied. They were expected, in a general sense, even if the specific timing and circumstances were not. I am not making the argument that the war diary system caused the victory at Long Tan. The battle was won by extraordinary men with exceptional fire discipline, supported by artillery that operated with near-perfect accuracy under impossible pressure. But the intelligence context into which D Company moved that day, the fact that one ATF knew there was a major enemy force in the province, knew its likely area of operation, had its artillery and response plans aligned with that knowledge, was not accidental. It was the product of a documentation discipline that had been building that picture, one daily entry at a time, for months. Now contrast this with American experiences in similar situations throughout 1966 and 1967. I spent weeks reading American after-action reports from operations where U.S. units had made large-scale contact without adequate warning. The pattern was not one of intelligence failure in the sense of an absence of information. The pattern was almost always the failure to connect information that was present in the system, but not sequenced in a way that revealed its meaning. A patrol observation from 3 weeks ago. A village-sourced report from 10 days ago. A signals intercept from 4 days ago. Each one filed, processed, forwarded. None of them sitting in the same document in sequence, where an analyst could lay his finger on them and say, "Look at the pattern." Major Barry Peterson, an Australian officer who operated extensively with CIDG forces in the Highlands, described the American reporting culture to me, or rather, to the interviewer whose transcript I found at the AUM, with characteristic directness. They were drowning in information, he said. Every headquarters was swimming in paper. But the paper didn't talk to itself. Our system made the paper talk to itself because you had to write today's entry with yesterday's sitting right there in front of you. The second moment that crystallized this for me came not from a battle, but from a routine patrol debrief in October 1967. An SAS patrol operating in the northern part of Phuoc Tuy had observed an enemy water point that had been in use for at least 3 days. The patrol had been static long enough to document movement patterns. The grid reference, the timing of use, the estimated numbers, all of it went into the war diary entry that evening. 6 weeks later, a cordon operation targeting that water point captured a 275 Regiment courier carrying documents that significantly advanced one ATF's intelligence picture of main force organization in the province. The thread connecting the SAS patrol's routine observation to that capture ran through 38 days of war diary entries. No single entry looked significant. Strung together, they pointed directly at the target. The Australian system wasn't static. It evolved. What I found when I traced the war diary records across the 1966 to 1971 period was a progressive refinement in how the daily intelligence summary interacted with operational planning. Early in the task force's deployment, the daily intelligence entries were essentially parallel tracks, useful as archives, consulted when needed, but not yet integrated into a systematic pattern analysis process. By 1968, the intelligence section at one ATF had developed what amounted to an informal protocol for mining the war diary retrospectively. Going back 60 to 90 days, when a new operational requirement emerged, pulling every relevant observation, building a picture that was simultaneously historical and predictive. Lieutenant Colonel Donald Dunstan, who served as task force commander in 1968 to 69, spoke in a post-war interview about the intelligence advantage the diary system produced. When I took command, the intelligence picture I inherited wasn't just current. It was deep. I could go back 18 months and see what the enemy had done in every grid square in the province. That's not something you build in a week. That's something you build by never stopping. On the American side, there was awareness, grudging in some cases, genuinely curious in others. that the Australians were doing something differently with their documentation. Several American liaison officers attached to one ATF in 1967-68 filed reports noting the Australian intelligence architecture with something approaching admiration. One such report, which I found in the records of MACVJ2, the Intelligence Directorate, noted that one ATF could provide enemy pattern of life analysis at the sub-provincial level with an accuracy and granularity not replicable in American operational areas of comparable size. MACV did make efforts to improve the granularity of American reporting. The 1967 revision of reporting procedures for LRRP teams increased the specificity required in patrol debriefs. The Phoenix program, which targeted the Viet Cong infrastructure from 1967 onward, emphasized continuous intelligence accumulation rather than periodic summary. These were genuine improvements. But they were improvements within an institutional culture that remained fundamentally oriented toward upward aggregation and quantification. The daily unit diary. The idea that every formation, every day, regardless of whether anything notable happened, would commit its observations to a contemporaneous written record, never became American doctrine in Vietnam. The Vietnamese, too, adapted to the Australian intelligence discipline, though perhaps not quite in the way one might expect. Enemy commanders operating in Phuoc Tuy became progressively more careful about pattern discipline, varying approach routes to water points, changing the timing of resupply movements, avoiding behaviors that previous observation had revealed as visible to the Australian patrol network. This was documented in the war diaries themselves. Entries noting that previously reliable enemy patterns had changed, hypothesizing about the reasons for the change, adjusting patrol coverage accordingly. What this revealed, and it's something I found genuinely striking as a pattern, was that the war diary was functioning not just as an intelligence archive, but as a feedback loop. The Australians documented their observations. They observed that the enemy was adapting. They documented that adaptation. They adapted in response. And that cycle of observation, documentation, analysis, and response was faster and more granular than the equivalent cycle on the American side. Not because of technology, not because of manpower, but because of a habit of daily written reflection that had been institutionalized for generations. By 1969, Phuoc Tuy Province was, by any reasonable metric, the most effectively controlled Allied province in South Vietnam. That assessment appears in multiple independent evaluations. The province team reports from CORDS, the Civilian Pacification Program, consistently ranked Phuoc Tuy in the highest tier for population security and government control. The Tet Offensive of 1968, which devastated Allied positions across the country, was significantly contained in Phuoc Tuy because one ATF's intelligence picture had provided sufficient warning to harden defenses and pre-position forces. The intelligence that enabled that response came, in material part, from the continuous documentation that the war diary system had been building since 1966. Brigadier Ron Gray, commanding one ATF in 1968, later described the pre-Tet period in language that struck me as significant. "We weren't surprised," he said flatly. "We didn't know the date or the scale across the country. But we knew something large was preparing in the province. We had weeks of indicators in the record. The cumulative patrol intelligence, documented daily, had shown a pattern of enemy prepositioning consistent with a major offensive operation. The war diary entries through December 1967 and January 1968 read, in retrospect, almost like a slow-motion forecast. Movement patterns changing, unusual resupply volume, reports of weapons caches from village sources. Each observation recorded the day it was made, the pattern visible only in the sequence. In terms of hard statistics, The evidence of the documentation system's contribution is embedded in the operational record. One ATF conducted successful cordon and search operations against specific enemy locations at a rate that consistently exceeded what base rates of patrol activity alone would predict, suggesting an intelligence-to-operation conversion rate that reflected the depth of the accumulated picture. SAS patrol intelligence was confirmed as accurate in follow-up operations at a rate that multiple post-war analyses have noted as exceptional by any standard. What the Americans noticed most, perhaps, was the prisoner capture rate. Australian operations in Phuoc Tuy consistently produced prisoner captures and document seizures at rates that surprised American liaison officers. Capturing prisoners requires knowing where the enemy is. Capturing documents requires reaching him before he destroys them. Both outcomes are products of precise, timely intelligence. And precise, timely intelligence, in the Australian system, was the product of a discipline that started with a quiet officer writing in a field diary at the end of each day. The captured documents, in turn, fed back into the war diary, analyzed, summarized, entered into the record. The picture deepened continuously. The Australian war diary system outlasted Vietnam. It outlasted the Cold War. Some version of it continues to function in the Australian Defence Force today, though digital systems have changed the medium. What hasn't changed is the underlying principle. The contemporaneous record, maintained continuously, is worth more than the retrospective summary, no matter how sophisticated. The lessons weren't lost entirely on the Americans, either. Post-Vietnam doctrine reviews, particularly those conducted under General Dupuy in the mid-1970s as the Army rebuilt after its Vietnam experience, included sustained analysis of Allied tactical approaches. The Australian intelligence architecture was among the case studies examined. Elements of it appear, filtered through American institutional culture and priorities, in the intelligence preparation of the battlefield doctrine that emerged in the late 1970s and became the foundation of American tactical intelligence through the Gulf War and beyond. Veterans from both sides, interviewed decades after the war, returned to a similar observation. The American soldier was better equipped, better supported logistically, better resourced in almost every quantifiable dimension. The Australian soldier was better oriented, better positioned within an intelligence picture that told him where he was in relation to the threat and where the threat was in relation to him. That orientation didn't come from technology. It didn't come from superior human sources. It came from a habit, a genuinely humble, unglamorous habit, of sitting down at the end of each day and writing what you saw. I've been thinking about that ever since I closed those archive boxes. In a war defined by an American obsession with quantifiable progress, body counts, Hamlet evaluation surveys, tonnage of bombs dropped, the Australians were doing something almost countercultural. They were insisting on the irreducible value of narrative, on the idea that understanding an enemy wasn't ultimately a statistical project. It was a reading project. You had to keep reading every day, and you had to keep writing. Because the act of writing forced you to articulate what you understood and what you still didn't. The young intelligence officer working through the night at Nui Dat in October 1966 wasn't doing anything heroic. He was doing his job. He was doing what every Australian unit had done every day since they arrived in Phuoc Tuy, writing down what they saw. It turned out to be one of the most effective things the Australian Army did in Vietnam.